You can look at this in a dispassionate way without politics by thinking about the personal values that both sides bring to the equation. You come to realize it's not controversial at all. You're thinking about things like, I want to innovate and disrupt and create a better future versus I want something more reliable and stable and something I feel comfortable with. Those ideas are not controversial. Some people think, well, I just want to be neutral. Well, there's no such thing. There's no such thing as neutrality.
It sounds to me like what you're presenting here is kind of a shortcut when you're building a campaign, that if you know that you're having this leniency towards, say, conservative, there's a bucket of values, a bucket of playbooks that you can execute that have a higher chance of succeeding because you've established this market base. Now I get to shortcut my testing because I have a grasp on this knowledge.
No, it's absolutely true. And, there's rich material for both groups of customers.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Selling with Love podcast. In today's world, I can see so many conversations happening online, maybe within your own families, where there's a lot of divide, particularly in America, around red, blue, politics. And it's become a subject that's almost so taboo that people shy away from speaking about it. So on Selling with Love today, I'm so excited to be bringing a guest who has went deep into looking at, if you're looking to sell your product and services, what are the things we should know if we're trying to find our target market when it comes to the red, the blue, and the political beliefs, the values, all of that comes into play? Should we be paying attention to it? What happens when we do? And what are we going to discover as we go down this rabbit hole, which could be considered controversial, but I'd say is very relevant in today's ecosystem, online and offline. The co-founder of LifeMind AI, Chris Peterson, is joining me today, and he's just released his book, Red and Blue Customers: How to Drive Growth and Manage Risk in Today's Conservative and Liberal Markets. The man has worked with large organizations through his agencies such as Peloton, Patreon, LendingTree, Microsoft, HP, Home Chef, and more, and has been in the realm of marketing, sales, running his agencies for more than a few decades. He's been around the block. He's seen the trends. And today he's speaking about one of the biggest ones where we're seeing this polarization, what comes to making people think differently, think the same. I don't know. I'm just as curious as everyone here. Chris, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks, Jason. Thank you for having me here.
Now, I was having a quick conversation with you before you started, which is what kind of gave you the impulse to do this research. You're someone that's very customer focused and you're looking at target markets. This is something very common. I even speak a lot for people, get to know your customers is one of the loves of selling with love. You've noticed something was completely missed from the equation, which was this political landscape, the red, the blue. And I'd want to go to this origin of what got you thinking, wow, this needs to be discussed right now.
Yeah. So it kind of happened serendipitously back in the end of 2020. And there was a piece of research that came out from Pew that allowed liberals and conservatives to tell each other what they wanted the other side to know. And it was right after the 2020 presidential election. And I'm a research junkie. I love reading research. And I read this. And the interesting thing about the research was it was an open-ended question. It let people just express themselves in a very personal way and non-confrontational way, what they wanted the other side to know about them. And I read it, several hundred responses because that's, because I just do that, I guess. And what struck me was that these were two groups of people with very authentic points of view who simply saw the world differently. And I thought, okay, if they see the world differently, how does this not affect what they buy? And so I dove into it shortly afterwards, and I got completely hooked on the topic because if you spend 10 or 15 minutes researching online differences in what liberals and conservatives buy, you'll find an enormous amount of evidence. I mean, there's overwhelming evidence that liberals and conservatives align with different brands, buy different products, and consume different media. They are two different markets. Now, do they overlap somewhat? Sure. Yeah, they're not completely exclusive, like how you describe customers in any other way. But I just could not believe that as a marketer, all the decades I've spent in the business, that we hadn't been looking at this, because it is a fundamental attribute of how someone shapes the world around them, which includes the products they include in their lives, whether it's, as a consumer or a business person.
We look at age, we look at marital status, we look at location. And if we look at what dominates conversations online, it seems to be these types of topics. And so the fact that it's not even been considered seems like you're missing out on a big piece of data. What would happen for somebody who'd not even be considering this variable? Would that lead to like hiccups, trip ups, or faux pas in the way that you position or you do your branding?
Well, the way I see it is it either creates a headwind or a tailwind. And if you are projecting values inadvertently, your own or your organization's, onto a market that has similar or different values, then that's where you're getting a headwind or tailwind. And what's interesting is that the more I studied businesses on this front, the more I realized that it was the founding of the business that typically established a culture which tends to include the worldview as liberal or conservative. And that ends up getting projected out. Now, if you're lucky, it meshes with the target audience that you really want to sell to. But if you're not so lucky, it's the headwind, and your acquisition costs are going to be higher, your customer value is going to be lower, and it's just going to be harder. And the great thing about this topic is that all it takes is some self-awareness and some understanding of how both sides think in order to create that tailwind and that level of fit that goes way beyond, solving a problem or addressing pain points or anything like that. This gets to how people see the world, how they think, and how they think your product might fit into their lives.
When I was working at Mind Valley, I think this would have been around 2016. So elections were underway. Trump has just won the elections out in America. And I was working for a Malaysian company, but our founder, which was a public figure, Vishen Lakhiani, was very vocal about his anti-Trumpness at the time. And I remember him making some very public statements to the audience on the social medias about, not approving of him, not being excited about him, saying like there was some very polarization stance that was taken. And I remember when that happened, there were, as a publishing company, there were some authors that just, oh my God, I can't believe you spoke about this. This isn't right. Some authors were like, we don't want to do business here. And like that. And then we were like, yeah, that's your business. That's fine. The company decided to take a stance. There's some customers that were like, we don't want to see this be political, so we're unfollowing. And it was like, we understand, but we want to speak our word about what we believe in. And then you had the rest of the audience, which was the core of our audience, which was quite blue in the sense of your colors in the book. And they rallied to the cause. They got double down of how like, oh, wow, like we understand where this company stands. So there was like a choice that was made. And when we did that, there was an energizing of its base, but then a kind of alienation of the others. And it led to some pause. There was a lot of skepticism saying, hey, we shouldn't have said anything. We should have stayed neutral. But a side was spoken. It came from the values of the founder, and the company kind of followed suit. And I have no other scenario to measure to say, was this good? Is it better to pick a side and knowing that there's going to be some exits and some energizing, or is it better to be neutral? Can you even measure if there's a difference? I'd be curious to know what the research found.
Yeah. So first of all, both markets are huge. Okay. That's the thing to keep in mind. They're both about the same size, and that's true in the United States. And I think it's true in most of the world. And what's also interesting is that both markets there's a distinction in income. So liberal customers have 20% higher income than conservative customers. But conservative customers, because of where they tend to live, have far lower cost of living. So when you net all these things out, they have equal spending power. They are two phenomenal markets. And so how you choose one is a really interesting question, right? In your case, it's a publishing company with a CEO, founder with clear liberal values who was very proactive in projecting that onto the market. He basically made the decision, I'm going to align with the more liberal portion of the market. Now, in that case, what strikes me is that he got a little lucky, okay? Because in publishing is a is a liberal industry, quite honestly. And a lot of writers tend to be more liberal. That doesn't mean that there aren't conservative publishing houses and conservative authors. But, I think there was a certain amount of alignment there. Now, should you pick one or the other? Some companies, like in your case, the decision came from, we're going to stand up for our values. Okay. And there was no negotiation. Okay. For other companies, it can be more about, well, we have our values, but we're interested in growing our business. So let's take a look at what the opportunities are. And I happen to be of a mind that you can look at this in a dispassionate way without politics by thinking about the personal values that both sides bring to the equation. Because when you study customers through their values, you come to realize it's not controversial at all. You're thinking about things like, I want to innovate and disrupt and create a better future versus I want something more reliable and stable and something I feel comfortable with. Those ideas are not controversial. But that is a very simple way to start positioning what you're doing in order to attract one group or the other. And I think when you study the two groups, a really interesting thing happens. This was an X factor in the research, and I've heard it from some of my readers, which is, no matter what side you align with, you cannot help but learn more about the other side when you study this topic. And no one today has any real incentive to do that, right? But in business, we now do. If you want to learn about both markets, then it doesn't take long to study how the two different markets think, how they operate, how they think about creating fit for themselves in terms of the products they buy. And that becomes really powerful because the more you get to know the so-called other side, the more familiar they become, the less controversial they become. The other side becomes more coherent, whether it's liberal or conservative, and the temperature actually comes down. And I experienced this in my own research. I just became far more calm about the way things were going in the world because I understood the so-called other side, much better. And I have readers who said the exact same thing without even me prompting them. And I think that's a very powerful X factor. And I think what it does is it enables people to look at markets in a more pluralistic way. It enables to look at them and think, you know what, people think differently than me, and that's okay. And I just want to understand them. And through business objectives, selling and marketing, I want to create fit for them and sell my products to them as long as I can avoid being judgmental. Because if judgment stays in the equation, it'll never work. It's just not going to work. You may as well just stick with your values, project them, and hope for the best. I personally don't think hope is a great strategy. So I tend to want to be more proactive about it and study it more closely.
I would love to hear, whether it's through your agency or through your research, what happens, or an example of a company that's paid attention to this, made a change. What did that look like? What results it brought in? So we can wrap around our heads of what things we could be considering in our own business as we start looking at our customers through this lens.
Yeah. So in the research, I did a deep dive into two companies that I found fascinating. One was apartments.com. And one was a WeatherTech. So apartments.com, the online portal for finding rental apartments. The other one, WeatherTech, they make rubber mats for cars. Okay. Two very different companies. Apartments.com, founded by what I could tell were liberal founders, project very strong liberal values in their marketing and sales. They have Jeff Goldblum as their spokesperson, and he's all about the future and inventing what they call in their ads, the apartmenternet. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but it's all about creating this wild new future, right? And there are even cats in the ads, and according to a Time magazine study, cats skew quite liberal. But anyway, everything adds up to dogs, by the way, are equal for both. So until you get down to the breed. Then you've got WeatherTech, founded by a conservative guy who clearly was projecting conservative values in his advertising. Like he ran Super Bowl ads with militaristic, sort of helicopters dropping people into a suburban front yard and installing rubber mats in a car. It was very clever. Both companies align with different markets, and they're both very successful. Okay, they're both very successful. Now, it happens to be that apartment renters skew quite liberal because they live in higher density, more urban populations. So the alignment of that marketing and sales with that audience is actually quite good. Car owners skew a little bit conservative, not as dramatically, askew, but clearly WeatherTech made that segment work extremely well. Neither company invokes politics. When you watch the ads, you don't see any politics. You don't see anybody, touting anything really controversial. But what you see are two companies that are creating tailwinds for themselves for these markets that they have aligned with. And again, they're both very successful. And I think any business, whether it's small or big, can look at this and decide, okay, well, maybe I want to align with one or the other based on maybe what I think the market is. And you have to do a little research around that. You can decide to go after both. But then, you have to make some choices. Like, some people think, well, I just want to be neutral. Well, there's no such thing. There's no such thing as neutrality. I have yet to see any business project somehow a magically neutral image. Now, they may stay out of politics, but when you look at the values and how they talk about themselves and how they position the products, there can be very clear cues as to whether it aligns with one group or the other. So, you want to get these things lined up. And the good thing is, this is strategy. This doesn't cost you anything except for thinking about it and aligning your business to a market you want to go after.
Well, you answered proactively already as something that came to mind, which is the fact that someone who wants to stay on the sideline, it's like, no, we all are going to have some certain behaviors, and it's not even about the politics side, but rather, are you someone that's about progress, innovation? And you've grouped some of these values already. Is there already just a quick assessment you can take that lets you self-assess, where do I stand? And is it something that you have to look at your own values before you look at the market? I'd be curious about that.
Yeah, so I think the most powerful approach to this is to ask yourself if you can step outside of yourself to consider this topic, okay? Because we can't help but project ourselves onto our decisions if we aren't aware of it. Okay. So I spent decades evaluating advertising. People would put stuff in front of me and say, here's 3 different ways to do this. Can you help us pick one? I'm like, sure. Well, I look back on that. I'm like, well, how did I make that decision? Well, I didn't think, through the eyes of the customer. I thought through my eyes. And I think the quick assessment you can make is, the book identifies 20 value categories where there are differences between the two groups. And I'll give you several of the most important ones. And then there are also 7 values that unite the two groups, which are also interesting. But examples of the differences, we talked about one relating to the future, which is, are you about reinventing the future, or are you about kind of more about reliability and stability? Change boundaries. Liberal customers are more willing to flex and change, conservative customers less so. That's an obvious one. That's something, people have been, saying for a long time. They'll say, well, conservatives don't want change. Well, that's not necessarily true. It's more conservative customers want to see proof and a product be reliable and proven, and then they will adopt it. So, for example, conservative customers buy a lot of Apple products. Apple tends to project a more liberal brand, but it is adopted by conservative customers because it's simply a very good product, and it's proven itself over the years. They make great products. Even Tesla, before Elon Musk took over Twitter, and certainly before his role today, Tesla cars were starting to trend more conservative because the Tesla cars were actually extremely well made. And they were proven, right? You can think of liberal customers as almost like being a filter for products that conservative customers will adopt. Okay. Like
Mm.
liberal customers will experiment and try new stuff. And along the way, they'll try some crappy stuff and throw it away. And the conservative customers will be like, well, okay, we're going to pick up what ends up being proven. So it's an interesting where the two markets actually work together in a very complementary fashion. But other values, like just real quick, I'll just rattle some off as examples, like self-moderation. Liberal customers are far more into self-expression, and conservative customers have a more of a desire for self-control. Now, this isn't going to explain everybody. That's the thing. There are always going to be exceptions, right? But if you want to define markets more broadly, these are themes that people can tap into. One interesting one related to sales is thought styles. Really interesting research around how more liberal customers tend to have a more free-flowing thought style for making a decision, taking in multiple inputs simultaneously and trying to achieve an aha moment. More conservative customers want something more linear, structured, not more thoughtful, but a more methodical approach toward reaching a decision. And that you can actually play on that in marketing and sales to a certain degree. Those are a few examples. So there's a bunch of them, and they're presented as like a menu, that any business can look down and go, oh, well, actually, these 5 or 7, those speak to something I can use for my products in my marketing and sales. So that's, and then you want to look at, do my customers skew liberal or conservative? That's a big question. And you can look at urbanicity, like do my customers, skew more urban versus more exurban or rural? Age, if my customers are older, they probably tend to, skew more conservative. Or you could just run a simple survey. Ask your customers, are they conservative, or liberal, or a little, liberal or a little liberal? You don't want to give them an option in the middle, because the fact is, there's very little in the middle. You don't want to let customers say, "Oh, I'm neither," because a lot of people will say that, but in fact, the research shows that everyone's pretty much sorted themselves along these lines over the last 50 years.
I've noticed in my own habits, behaviors, priority of values, how I've had some shifts in the way that I navigate the world from being a very progressive person. The only good idea is a new idea. And
Yes, the
I'm getting
shiny
closer.
object.
I had the now I don't like shiny objects at all. I'm a boring man who likes what he likes, and I'm still in my mid age here, and so I can see myself skewing more towards being someone of conservative value, and I'm curious as an organization becomes aware of this, and maybe the founder's values change. Maybe after you do the research, you're finding yourself, hey, maybe we should actually be going for a different market. And let's use this example, which is maybe coming from liberal, going to being more conservative. When you make that shift, are there some risks that exist when you start communicating that differently? Is it something that if you decide to step towards, are you supposed to make a declaration of it? I'd be curious if there's case studies or some things we need to look out for if we're going to be stepping into this in a big way.
Well, I think you can do it one of two ways. You can step into it in a very big way and just decide. And maybe it's because, the organization's values are so entrenched, they're just not going to change, right? And then there's always going to be some risk with that. The way you mitigate that risk is you align your marketing and sales toward the market that will be receptive to that. And that speaks to marketing media plans, targeting the organizations that your sales organizations go after, where those companies are located. The other option, which I think more companies will adopt, is to test it, is to simply test different. You can use digital media, you can use connected television, you can try it in sales pitches, you can just test some of the ideas to see if it resonates well. I'll give you an example of an interesting research study we ran in the fitness area where, fitness is a huge market, right? Well, one reason is because liberal customers and conservative customers both love to exercise. Okay. And that's proven out by some YouGov research. Well, but if you get within the fitness category, we ran research that showed that conservative customers are twice as likely to want something related to strength versus fitness. And liberal customers were the opposite. They were more interested in fitness twice as much versus strength. So this starts to get to, and now, not coincidentally, we're working with a fitness organization whose product is pretty focused on strength. And I can tell you their customers are overwhelmingly conservative. It doesn't mean they're far right. It just means that a very strong majority are conservative. So, these are some of the nuances you can get into, but it really does, I believe, unlock new opportunities for companies to just become more efficient, quite honestly. To just think about this alignment, stepping into it in a big way or not, you can test into it in a variety of different ways.
It sounds to me like what you're presenting here is kind of a shortcut when you're building a campaign, that if you know that you're having this leniency towards, say, conservative, there's a bucket of values, a bucket of playbooks that you can execute that have a higher chance of succeeding
Yes.
because you've established this market base and it's got so many commonalities. And so the risks go down for you to run any campaign. If you're like, hey, if I'm a very conservative, I'm not going to talk about new, innovative, never before seen. It would be like completely risky and probably would fail. Now I get to shortcut my testing because I have a
Yes.
grasp on this knowledge.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely true. And, there's rich material for both groups of customers. And I think by being aware of both, not only can you create a tailwind for yourself by weaving in the values that are more appropriate for your customers and your market, you can also avoid what you just mentioned. You can avoid going out there with the wrong message, right? And that's just as important in considering this, because the other research, we did some interesting research in terms of the worldview predisposition inside a company. Okay. And we found that 67% of marketing people were more liberal. 68%, it was kind of odd, almost the same number, of salespeople were more conservative. So if you think about all the chatter about why don't these two groups get along better, there you have it. Okay. And but it doesn't mean it's conflict, because actually what emerges from the research is actually the two groups are very complementary. And these job roles tend to almost act like a filter for drawing certain types of people, including a worldview predisposition. And that exists across an organization, whether it's HR or finance or product development. And that becomes interesting to consider because that enables more self-awareness about how the organization is engaging with its markets. And like I said, you can do this in a dispassionate way if you just look at the values that people use versus the politics.
I'd be curious to know how much of this research would overlap to segmenting, say, along gender. Because I'd see like a similar skew, and it's just because you brought the marketing and sales example where there's so much more women that find themselves in marketing, a lot more men find themselves in sales. Have you seen any of that being correlated, related,
Well,
dependent?
yeah, I've looked at it a little bit, and women tend to skew a little bit more liberal, but it's not dramatic.
Mm.
I think it would be a mistake if someone had a heavily skewing female customer as a market. I would not assume that they're liberal. And I'll give you an example. I looked at the data from a women's shoe company, and on the face of it looks extremely liberal. Like, you look at the website and you look at the self-expression, and then you consider the fact they had 3 retail locations, one in San Francisco, one in New York, and one in Seattle. Okay. Looked at the customer data, and strong majority were conservative. And so there was something there about those shoes that was pulling in a conservative audience in spite of the values being projected on the market. And to me, that looked like nothing but opportunity, you know, in order to do some testing and some potential alignment. Didn't get that far with that company, but I thought it was a fascinating example of a disconnect, which on the face of it, you might go, oh gosh, that's a problem. It's like, no, it's not a problem. Actually, this is probably the cheapest way to create a tailwind for yourself that there is. Because like I said, it's strategy. It's not, you don't have to go buy new software or anything like that.
If someone's paying attention to this conversation right now and they're like, I would love to do some sort of pulse check. I think you've mentioned that there's kind of an assessment tool people can use to kind of run a bit of an idea. And I'd love for you to share that with us so that if somebody's like, hey, this is intriguing, I want to maybe go a little deeper, what could be a next step we could take?
Yeah. So there are some ideas in the book, Red and Blue Customers, but we also have a tool that we can run for companies for free on our site. We're actually building a platform that helps kind of weave all of this into customer segmentation together with generation and region values. And so we've set up a page. It's basically lifemind.ai/selling with love. And so for the listeners, you can go there and upload a simple customer file, no sensitive data, no names or addresses or anything like that, just zip codes, honestly. And find out if your customer is more liberal or conservative. And, sometimes it's a surprise, sometimes it's not, but I guarantee you it will not be 50-50. There will be a skew in there. We've seen small skews, we've seen huge skews. And, today I mentioned the fitness company skewing heavily conservative. We're working with another company, a very large company with a mobile app. It's overwhelmingly liberal. And, what's fascinating is when we look at potential media plans that go along with those two markets, they're dramatically different. And it's not just Fox News versus CNN. It goes far deeper than that, because the media skews, how you place your media investment can have a dramatic effect on this. But yeah, so that we can, within a couple of days, we can tell you, whether your customers skew more liberal or conservative. It might be kind of fun, but just go to that page, lifemind.ai/selling with love, and we'll run it for you.
Thank you so much for that. We'll put a link in the show notes for all of you. You can check it out and you'll be able to click on that and go and check out if you want to run an assessment on your own list. I think it'll bring out some very interesting insights. And of course, pick up a copy of the book. It just came out and it's going to let you go and dive deeper. As I mentioned, selling with love starts with love the customer. That's the second love of selling with love, which means you need to go and understand. I think this is a lens that's been largely ignored. And I'd be curious to know in your own organization, how you approach companies, and this is the product that you offer. How have you been able to use this in how you sell? Have you noticed that the types of customers that are interested in your products are more liberal, more conservative? Because I would assume being such an innovative idea should be probably much more liberal interest or blue interest in what you sell.
Yeah, so there is serendipitous alignment between selling, a product like this to marketers, because you're right. It's a new way to think about markets. It's a new way to think about customers. And marketers are, a strong majority are quite liberal. But I got to be honest with you, when we engage with companies, once they see past the politics of it, everyone gets very interested in this. They're like, huh. Because like you said, at the beginning, it's like, it can be so obvious, like, God, we need to look at this, but we don't. And so you take the politics out, like, this fitness company that we're working with, they're relatively conservative people running this company. They're equally interested in this, quite honestly. But yeah, in general, the alignment to marketers. Oh, by the way, there's interesting research that New York Times published years ago, which says that people can intuitively tell if someone is liberal or conservative in a couple of seconds. And it's through the facial expressions, how the mannerisms, how people dress. And it was remarkable accuracy. So like if you're in a sales situation, you might find yourself having this kind of gut reaction, but then instead of it taking you to politics, take it to what their potential values might be and speak to those values. And and see your product through their values, not yours, because that's probably the most powerful way to think about it.
I don't know why, but the first thing that comes to mind is there's this fitness place here in Bali where I stay called Power and Revive. I'll share a bit of love by mentioning them here, but given that their audience I think is quite liberal in what research you shared, I should give them the suggestion. They shouldn't be called Power and Revive. They should actually be like Fitness and Revive. Or then again, I think the word that was used was strength. So,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, you can test this stuff. You know,
hmm,
you can run simple customer surveys that cost you nothing to
hmm.
ask people, like, how about these different words? But then ask the question, do you tend to be a bit more liberal or a bit more conservative as that filter, right? And you will see differences.
Oh, that's it. Yeah. You're running any kind of survey data. Ooh, it almost seems like, and you're right, if you're asking that kind of question, you have to make it mandatory. You can't make it neutral. And
Right.
then you can actually segment your results to see what's going on. And
Yeah.
there's a part of me that's like, wow, then like you start having home runs with every campaign if you're starting to speak the language that you know has a high chance of resonance. And the initial fear that I would have is, are you creating like an echo chamber into how you're speaking? Are you ignoring a side? But it sounds like you've built empathy for both sides when you start going down this rabbit hole.
Well, it's a choice you can make. And I think the message here is to make it intentional. Don't make it happenstance because, again, what I see are tailwinds and headwinds all over the place and people don't even realize it. It also explains, campaign failures from my past in an interesting way, where I was like, wow, that was a big one. And we didn't know why it didn't work. And I look back on it now, I'm like, oh, I get it now. Yeah, that was a complete mismatch on a pretty decent scale. But I think it's just coming around to considering that both markets are very good and use business objectives as an incentive to learn about both sides better. And you'll learn more about yourself as well as the other side. And it becomes a really interesting journey in general. You can't help but let it become personal as you use it to help you professional.
One of the selfish ways I'm going to start thinking about this idea is I'm realizing selling with love as a positioning with love is probably much more appealing to liberal values, but the marketing is a conservative group. And so I'm thinking perhaps
Well,
the next things I need to look at is marketing with love.
yeah. Well, it's maybe. I mean, so I'll try to do this one really quick. There's really interesting research around empathy where liberal customers have more empathy for wide ranging groups of people, like people they don't know, friends maybe versus family. Conservatives have equal amounts of empathy, but it tends to be for more hierarchical structured things like family. So family, love, friends, wider circles is an interesting distinction that, I would give you. And so now the funny part about that research that I loved was that not only do liberal customers or liberals have more empathy for a wider range of circles, it extends to non-humans, including aliens and rocks. So, yes. So I had this theory. I don't know. You may be too young to remember the pet rock as a
No,
product.
no, I remember that. I think I was
Okay.
being targeted for that.
Okay. I had this idea to track down the company and say, look, I have to know if all your customers are liberal because the pet rock would, speak to that, but I haven't gotten around to it yet.
Nice. Gosh, I'd be curious to hear about, your big intent and your wider impact you want to make with, your book just came out. Tons of people are going to be reading this. They're going to be making some adjustments. What's the why? What are you hoping to see happen in the marketplace as more and more people adapt this worldview that start implementing these strategies? What are you hoping to achieve?
Well, I think there are a lot of big things that came out of the research that I did not expect. Okay. And one of them I already told you about, which is the equal power of the two markets. Okay, that was interesting. Because I had people telling me, it's like, oh, no, 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 this market's much better. I'm like, no, they're actually the same. But I think the big thing that emerged from all the research that I found super interesting was the complementarity of the two sides versus the conflict. And I found it in the research within organizations. I mentioned, the different job roles and job functions. I mean, people come together all day in larger organizations to work together in a very complementary way with different worldviews, and those worldviews tend to align with different job functions. I mean, the research is pretty clear. So it's complementary there. It's complementary in markets where you have, I mentioned, newer products being tested by more liberal customers and conservative customers picking up the good stuff and running with it. So if you want to achieve massive scale, then you need both working together in order to achieve maximum market potential. And then when I looked at the values themselves, I came to realize that there's nothing wrong with any one set of values. There's nothing wrong with wanting to innovate to a great degree. There's nothing wrong with something with something that's more proven or reliable. And we all, I think, have different moments of wanting those things. It's just a question of, does one tend to win out over the other? And what I see, what I would love for everyone to see in the work is this complementarity, because that enables you to open up to the possibility of, not only bigger markets and more tailwinds in your business, but also just thinking about the world quite differently in a more pluralistic fashion, where maybe the way you see the world is not the way everyone else sees it, and maybe that's not a bad thing.
I'm very grateful that you decided to lean into what could be perceived as very controversial as a topic, but in essence is promoting a lot better understanding across both aisles. And I think if we're going to see a lot more people actually start thinking about this, caring more in the way that they message, have more success, have more impact, it looks like a win across the board for anybody who decides to invest a bit more time to care about learning this material. So I'm so grateful for you of putting it together. I'm grateful for the time we're spending together. I want to encourage everyone, again, we're going to put a link. If you have a list of zip codes and you want to have an assessment of where your customers lie, you'll be able to use that tool. We'll have a link in the show notes, and pick up a copy of Red and Blue Customers, How to Drive Growth and Manage Risk in Today's Conservative and Liberal Markets. Now, Chris, one more thing I need to ask you since you're on the show. You're on the Selling with Love podcast, and I need to ask you, what does selling with love mean to you?
Oh, I think it means selling in a way that you can have the ultimate empathy for the person you're talking to, but in a manner where you can possibly try to see the way that they do and not just the way that you do, and to see what differences there might be and do that in a non-judgmental way. And I think that ultimately is a great way to establish a relationship, whether it's in marketing or sales or just, as you interact with the world.
Chris, thank you so much for your time, your wisdom. For everybody else tuning in, this is a lens you definitely want to start thinking about in the way that you market, you sell, to get you a better alignment with the values, having more effectiveness in your campaigns, and hey, having a lot more heart for both sides of the aisle, as we mentioned earlier. This has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's been great.
Thank you so much for listening to the Selling with Love podcast. We have some previous episodes you can tune into right here. And if you prefer the short form content where you get to the point in under 10 minutes, we do have a ton of clips from our best episodes that are being shared on this channel as well. So pick which one supports you the most. And of course, thank you for liking, subscribing, and of course, selling with love.